how modeling FDA, how modeling is also, and then how modeling is relevant to CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, which is the center in FDA that I'm in. This is going to be a kind of overview talk on touching upon various different subjects, including modeling at FDA, modeling at CDRH, the different types of models that we either do work research here with or receive submissions in. Talk a little bit about credibility assessment of modeling, because that's a major focus of CDRH's research at the moment, and a little bit, if I have time, on some research that I've been doing with cardiac models related to uncertainty quantification. So let's start by trying to emphasize how FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is more than just food and drugs. FDA is tasked with ensuring the safety of various products, including drugs, which is the main medical product, but also medical devices, biologics. This center will be the center that evaluates the COVID vaccines that are being submitted right now, but also food, tobacco products, veterinary medicine, and we also have another center that supports the other centers by doing research into toxicology. I'm in the Center for Devices, CDRH, and what a lot of people don't know is that CDRH actually has a research office called OSEL, the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories, where we perform what we call regulatory science research, which is research that could be experimental, computational, or any kind of data science that supports the regulatory review of products submitted to the FDA. The main office is OPEC, the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, which is the office where the staff there actually review the files. Scientists in OSEL also are involved in the review of files by providing what we call basically consultations. At CDRH, there are 3 traditional sources of evidence that are used to support decision-making and used to support the safety and effectiveness of medical devices: bench testing, animal testing, clinical trials. Increasingly, computational modeling results have been used as a 4th kind of source of evidence for safety or effectiveness of medical devices. And modeling and simulation is something that in the last 10 years, FDA has really been ahead of the game in terms of understanding the importance of advocating modeling and simulation methodologies. And this is just an example of that from a blog post by the previous Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, where he talked about the use of how we really want to move towards using more modeling and simulation, not just for devices, but for all sorts of products, including drugs. So modeling and simulation is basically understood by senior management at the FDA as being a kind of vital new tool for evaluating medical products and other products that FDA regulates. So that's great, because sometimes you have people working in these areas, but it not being acknowledged by management. Something that we did a year before last, I think, was there's a modeling and simulation working group where we tried, and one of the things that we tried to do was basically survey scientists who either work with computer modeling or computational models, or review computational modeling results or computational model-based products that are submitted to FDA, to try and get an idea of the kind of full landscape of how modeling and simulation is relevant to FDA. And we created this figure, which basically in the rows here are all sorts of different simulation fields. The columns represent major different kind of buckets of ways simulation could be used. The main ones that are relevant to FDA are pre-market product review. So that's kind of using simulation and kind of when you submit a product to FDA for marketing clearance or approval. Post-market product assessment. So that's using simulation in some way after the market, after a product has gone to market, to answer a regulatory question, because FDA is also tasked with ensuring that products remain safe after they go to market. So if there's adverse events, we ensure that we're following the reporting and take action as necessary. We also release policy. So there's policy development and policy implementation that we included as two buckets in this survey, and we collected information on how it's used in each of the different centers that I mentioned in the first slide, and you get an idea of how widespread simulation is, certainly for certain centers like the drug center, CEDA, which is the biggest center by far. Not surprisingly, simulation is very established there. It's used in some form or another across a wide variety of different fields. The devices center, that's also the case to a slightly lesser extent. We see very clearly here how the devices, the fields, the simulation fields where that are relevant to the devices center are, for the most part, the kind of traditional physics-based engineering, mechanics, heat transfer, electromagnetism, and so on. The physiological modeling, which is what cardiac modeling would fall under. There's also relevant to devices, and that's where we kind of overlap with the drugs a little bit. And then you can also see how the food center uses a fair amount of modeling, and the other centers are a bit less. It's all about kind of the maturity of the field in these different application areas, the number of people who work in these different application areas, because you need the more people are working in an area, the more likely it is that there's mature and good groups that do modeling in that area. And this just kind of goes to show how much scope there is for how much potential for simulation across all these different application areas and all these different ways of using models in the columns. So that was talking about FDA as a whole. Now focusing on CDRH only, medical devices. This slide covers the different ways that simulation is relevant to medical devices. I mentioned it earlier on how simulation is a fourth source of evidence for testing, virtual testing, basically of a real physical medical device. And that's one way that simulation can be used, where the model is of the device only. We can try and simulate how the device is going to perform on the bench to perhaps reduce or entirely eliminate bench testing. As well as a model of a device, you can also have a model of a virtual device embedded in a virtual patient of some kind. So that's an application where we're still testing a physical device, but we're testing it under in vivo conditions to try and get a better understanding of safety or effectiveness questions. The third example here is where the model is the device, or for example, the model is part of a device. There's two different cases here. So something called software as a medical device, where there's no physical device. The software is the device is a software piece of software, and embedded in that software is an algorithm that generates a patient-specific computational model and provides some information for the clinician. Also, alternatively, it could be software within a physical medical device that uses a computational model of some kind. The point about this case is it's the patient. Each patient is being simulated. So these are digital twins, and these can be thought of as cohorts of digital twins if they're generated in that way. Going through, so I'm going to, in the next 3 slides, I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit more depth. So going through these different cases, simulating virtual devices for regulatory submissions. So for example, that could be a solid mechanics model that simulates the stresses and strains on a stent under kind of bench test conditions to predict which part of the stent or the implantable device is going to fracture, because that's one of the major questions about implantable devices. What's the fracture risk of those devices? And there are well-established bench testing methodologies that are slowly being reduced or hoped to be kind of ultimately eliminated by simulation. Challenges here are computational expense. Anyone who's worked in solid mechanics in any way knows that understanding material properties is always a challenge. There's also the challenge of going from the kind of quantitative interest predicted by the models, which are stresses and strains, to the real clinical quantity that is of interest, which is fracture rate. And there's also obviously certain challenges related to validation, though it's certainly easier to validate these types of models than models that simulate the body. So moving on to those types of models, models of medical devices that are coupled to models of the patient or a patient or a set of patients in some way. So examples of that on the left-hand side, one major area is based around the question of MR safety of metallic implantable devices. So metallic devices that are implanted in a patient have the potential for absorbing energy from a MR machine if the patient undergoes MR imaging for whatever reason, and that energy will then be deposited as heat at the ends of the device, and that can cause tissue damage and potential serious injury or death. So metallic devices will need to be supported by evidence that they're safe to be used in an MR machine if they're going to be labeled as being MR conditional, basically, like if they're going to be labeled as being okay to be used with MR magnetic resonance imaging. And clearly doing clinical trials to study the heating that occurs in these settings would be unethical. So various groups have been working in this area, simulating the energy absorptions using electromagnetic models, solving Maxwell's equations, and developing these very high fidelity anatomical models of a range of patients that cover the general population, including male, female, child, a range of body masses, pregnant woman, and the idea is that these what's called this virtual family are a set of anatomical models where manufacturers can embed their virtual model of a device and simulate heating or simulate energy absorption. So that's a major area where devices are embedded in virtual devices are embedded in virtual patients or virtual subjects. Another example is based around the idea of physiological closed loop control devices. So these are devices that are used in the hospital or in an emergency setting or a medical setting where they take information recorded from the patient and automatically actuate some therapy. They're basically the equivalent of a self-driving car for medical devices. And an example is automated mechanical ventilation, or automated anesthesia, automated fluid infusion for patients that are suffering from hemorrhage. And as you know, just understanding how the complexity with the efforts that are being made right now to try and create these self-driving cars. Clearly, there's lots of questions about safety. It's a very difficult problem to solve. Same kind of issues arise with physiological closed-loop medical devices, and virtual patients are one tool that can be used for evaluating these types of devices. So the idea is to replace, when we do the testing, you can replace the real patient with a computational model of the patient. You can either do everything computationally, or you can do something called hardware in the loop testing, where you have a computational model of the patient coupled to some kind of signal generator that's fed into the real patient monitor, that's passed into the real, whose outputs are passed to the real therapy delivery device, and then so there's some kind of actuator transfer mechanism that converts that into inputs to the computational model. So that's a way of doing testing without having to go through the process of doing a full clinical trial or a clinical study or animal tests. Then there's this idea of reducing clinical trial sizes, and that's an area that various people are working in. FDA has been collaborating in, working with statisticians and industry. And basically, this paper is one of the first papers that tries to propose a statistical framework for doing clinical trials in parallel with an in silico clinical trial, and using the in silico clinical trial information to maybe end the trial early, the real trial early. And that's a very powerful idea, because millions of pounds, dollars, euros could be saved by reducing the size of clinical trials or ending them early. Challenges related to these types of models are basically the same kind of challenges as I listed before, but magnified. So greater computational expense, greater challenges characterizing tissue properties. Validation becomes even more difficult, and there's also a question of fidelity. How much anatomical detail do you need? That's true of any kind of physiological modeling. Same kind of issues for developing these patient models as well. The third example here, where we start to talk about cardiac models that are used as clinical decision support tools, where the model is of the models. These are not models that are pre-generated by academia or industry virtual cohorts that are used for that are pre-generated and used for device testing, but the models are of each new patient as they come in. And as all of you are very well aware, one common workflow, though by no means the only workflow, is to base this on patient imaging data, and use that as the main source of patient-specific data that's used for the patient-specific model. And there are two main devices that have been released that are on the market: the HeartFlow device, which uses CT imaging to generate a 3D representation of the coronary arteries, and then simulates fluid flow to identify a clinical quantity called fractional flow reserve, which basically predicts which parts of the vasculature are blocked, and to the extent to which they're blocked. And then there's the Cardio Insight device, which the HeartFlow is basically software as a medical device. Cardio Insight is a physical software device, but it has in its algorithm a computational model, which basically solves the backward problem and takes in the electrograms on the body surface and simulates the epicardial activity on the heart. And then there's the work that various groups around the world are doing, and the TriANOVA group have a clinical trial in progress around using patient-specific cardiac modeling for ablation. So challenges here, again, computational expense, but now we need to do it in, if not real time, then a clinical time frame, so at least say overnight. So there's certain increasing computational expense, increasing computational challenges. Then there's a challenge over determining what kind of personalization is necessary. So do we need to personalize the geometry, or we always do personalize the geometry, and that turns out to be often sufficient, but that's only really done because it's the most easiest source of data, but potentially some application areas you might need to also personalize the material properties or functional properties. And then there's the challenge of doing scientific validation of the quantities that the model predicts versus clinical validation of the quantities that you're really interested in. And there's challenges around how the models can be, to the degree to the model is a black box versus a glass box. So I'm going to kind of skip through. I guess I should try and finish at 8:30 also, so that we have plenty of time for questions. So some of these slides I'll go a little bit quickly through, and I won't have time to go into detail of the later slides. But basically, CDRH is tasked with understanding whether models that are submitted to us are reliable, trustworthy. The word we use is credible, which is defined as the predictive credibility is defined as the predictive capability of a computational model, the trust and predictive capability of a computational model. And we've been collaborating with industry and academia on the development of this standard, the BNB 40 standard, which some or many of you will be familiar with. The first standard that is solely on the subject of credibility of computational models. Something that's quite exciting is that OCEL, the research office that I'm in, has recently formalized its research around these 20 different areas that are considered very important, and credibility of computational models is one of those areas that was chosen. So that chose to show that how important senior management consider computational modeling, and how important they consider the reliability of computational modeling. I'll skip through this slide. We're kind of undergoing the rollout of this program and developing the goals for this program, but basically kind of 4 very high level goals are developing credibility assessment frameworks, developing guidances, which are what FDA releases to industry to explain how we make our decision making, working with industry on developing standards, doing domain-specific research related to the credibility of specific types of computational models, such as heart models, such as solid mechanics or fluid models, and 2 others that I'm not going to go into. In terms of this first high-level program goal, some of the things that we will be hopefully working with industry or delivering over the near future in the next few years is a guidance on the use of BNB 40 in regulatory submissions. We'll be collaborating in the revision of BNB 40 that is being worked on right now. And there's this idea of good simulation practices, where this is the idea that we have good manufacturing in other areas. We have good manufacturing practices, good laboratory practices, good clinical practices. What we really want as a community is good simulation practices to complement and support, to complement those others. And that's something that the community will hopefully work on over the near future. I know that the Abby Chenner Alliance has been heavily focused on that in recent months. I'll skip this slide. Very briefly, the BNB 40 standard, provides a framework for going through the process of credibility assessment that's linked to model risk. It's not a prescriptive framework, and it doesn't give specific targets or anything for any kind of type of model, and that's not really possible with the broad scope of this standard. But it goes through a framework for the user where basically starts off by asking the user to define the question of interest, how specifically a model will be used. So what specifically the model will be used to answer. So is it a safety question about a device, an effectiveness question about the device? Is it going to is the patient suffering from some kind of condition? Then how specifically will the model be used to answer that question, the context of use? And then assess the model risk, which is considered to be based on two separate factors. The decision consequence, which is how much the model is used in the decision making versus other sources of evidence like bench testing. And the influence is that. And then the decision consequence, which is what is the consequence of an adverse event if the question of interest is answered completely incorrectly. So, for example, if a model is used to identify worst performing cases for fatigue risk, which are then tested on the bench for an implantable device, then the decision consequence might be kind of medium if a device that fractures is a serious event but not life-threatening, and influence is medium because of you will be doing some bench testing, so the overall risk is medium, versus hypothetical patient support model where we'll be in a high-risk situation where a clinician will be basing their decision-making entirely on the model. That's high decision consequence and high influence, and so the risk is high. And then the framework basically asks the user to go through verification, which is evaluating whether the model is implemented correctly, validation, which is comparing to real-world data in some way, and applicability, which is assessing the relevance of the validation efforts for the context of use. And BNB40 breaks these down into these so-called credibility factors, which are basically things to look at in more detail for each of these tasks. One of the things that we're working on right now that is worth looking out for in the next few years is something that's a collaborative project between industry, academia, and FDA, where the idea is the goal is to provide an end-to-end example of using simulation in a medical device regulatory submission related to these devices, which are in vivo CAVA filters, which are implanted in the leg to catch blood clots. There are various safety and effectiveness questions related to those, and they're basically using modeling and simulation to answer those questions using flow simulations and solid mechanics. And they're basically going to go through the process of submitting that to FDA, even though FDA is leading this project. There's two teams. There's a team that's going to act as the sponsor that submits the evidence to FDA. There's a separate team at FDA which is going to review the evidence and go through the entire process of this submission. That's why it's called a mock submission. We'll eventually release all this information to the public so that they can see the entire process laid out. I'm not going to have time to go through the UQ stuff that I have been working on, but maybe I'll just end with the So there's a paper that I will end that you can look at if you're interested in how some research relates to uncertainty quantification for cardiac models. So final couple of slides. What will the future hold? Everything is changing very, very quickly. I've been talking about physics-based models or mechanistic-based models, but there's also the statistical data-driven machine learning models, which are also a huge area right now. And as you all know, because of the great paper that was published that we all worked on, that Pablo led on using both types of models in for cardiology. So we'll increasingly have these types of all types of models integrated with increasing amounts of the available data, real-time data, imaging data, other data that's taken from the patient, genetic information. And we'll also have models that potentially auto-update, maybe even auto-validate. So there's huge amounts of challenges there for everyone concerned, especially especially governments who have to regulate these. But the ultimate goal is truly personalized medicine. So to conclude, simulation is a regulatory science priority for FDA and has for years impacted regulatory decision making at CDRH through in silico device testing. But now we are tasked with evaluating models in a wide range of application areas, from device testing to in silico clinical trials as those start to happen, and models used within medical devices. But we're actively promoting modeling and simulation and trying to work with industry on developing these frameworks for credibility assessment. So I will end there. Thanks for your attention, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Pras. There was a second that I lost the connection, so hopefully it doesn't happen now. Moderating questions. Audience, questions, curiosities. Some further clarification.
Can I
yes.
go ahead?
Yeah.
Hi, Pras. Thanks a lot for the great talk. I'm wondering if you would like to make a short comment about your career journey. Like maybe you mentioned it in the first minute of your talk. Maybe I have missed it because I was like a minute late. But if you were, I think it's really useful for the people that are following us, because I know that you went into mechanics, if I remember correctly, in the beginning of your career, mostly, and then you're in FDA, which is really a great journey. So I think it's really useful for all of us to know what drove you to get into FDA and what were the challenges from a more concrete modeling background, moving into something where you oversee a whole lot of procedures and more political, strategical planning. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it's a great question, and it has been an interesting experience. So yeah, for those of you who haven't met from when I was in England, I did my PhD and postdoc in Oxford, where I met Pablo and Steve Niederer and lots and lots of people. And eventually I was offered the opportunity to come to America to work for FDA on a research project. And yeah, I was working on cardiac models, but with some electrophysiology, but I was doing a lot of work on mechanics at the time. But I was offered the opportunity to come to FDA for what I thought was only going to be 1 year or maybe 2 years on a project related to cardiac EP for a device application. A traditional research project, traditional postdoc. Basically, FDA does. OCEL does have postdoctoral positions. But I wasn't really expecting to stay there. But it turned out that I came to FDA at a really great time personally, because CDRH was understanding that it really needed to understand credibility of computational models, and I found that an interesting subject. And it's interesting for EP models, interesting for physiological models in general. But it allowed me to do research that covered a wide range of application areas. So I started to move in that field, and that led to a permanent position here. In terms of the background of people here, I'm rare that I'm in the sense that I have a maths background. There are a lot of biomedical engineers at FDA, statisticians, mathematical statisticians, other types of engineers, but a single maths background is unusual, I think. So in that sense, I was unusual at FDA. But yeah, it's a great place to work for people who are interested in computational modeling, as I emphasized, that the people, senior management, understand the importance of it. And there are lots of model-related questions that need to be answered.
And especially about the regulation and the standardization of those models, right? Because there are issues on how accurate they need to be.
Yeah, and we have, like I say, we have this program that was formalized on the credibility assessment of computational models, which just goes to show how important that's considered. But we have people also working with computational models, and even the people who who do lab work or do experimental science. Some of those are increasingly getting into modeling just because they either see the value or see how important it's considered. Can be helpful in a situation like this where you're forced to do most of your research at home right now.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks, Pras. More questions or curiosities? Audience? I'm sure there must be. Joe.
Hi. Nice presentation. I
Thank
just
you.
wanted to ask in your view, how long does it take to process since it arrives to FDA the proposal of a new product? How long does it take until usually it gets approval? Like, I guess it varies.
It varies, but yeah, it's so. Unlike maybe some other agencies, FDA has these agreements, legal agreements with industry as a whole, called the MDUFA agreements, where basically industry does pay money to FDA. So our funding doesn't just come from Congress and taxpayers via Congress, but it also comes from industry. And in return, there are these deadlines that FDA is obliged to meet in terms of how long we take to review a product, and how long the deadlines are depend on the type of regulatory submission. So the simpler products come in under something called the 510K approval or clearance process, where you basically have to show that the device is equivalent in terms of safety and effectiveness to another chosen device, what's called a predicate. And I can't remember the exact MDUFA deadline timelines, but I think it's something like 3 months that we're supposed to respond by. And then, but the high risk ones that go through the PMA process, it's probably something like 6 to 9 months. And then typically, like, a product isn't going to be approved in the first round. We'll provide feedback and deficiencies, and that will have to be kind of like going through the journal submission process on steroids. And so we'll go through a few rounds of that. So it varies a lot. So the total amount of time from initial submission to being on the market varies a lot depending on the type, but we're talking like a year to a few years.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks. Makes sense.
Any other curiosity? Any other question for Pras? As in previous talks, I will highlight that yes, Pras is a really nice and accessible person. So if you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to contact him. I'm sure he will be keen and glad to engage with the community at all the levels.
Yeah, I didn't put my email address, but on here, but yeah, I mean, I think that's easy enough to look up in any of my papers, and yeah, feel free to email me.
Exactly.